The judge asked why I didn't bring the documentation from my safe. My brother smiled. I cleaned it out. He didn't need it. The courtroom went quiet. Then the judge did something nobody expected. The moment my brother Garrett smiled in that courtroom, I knew he thought he'd won. He sat at the plaintiff's table in his tailored navy suit, his attorney whispering something in his ear that made him nod slowly, confidently. Meanwhile, I stood at the witness stand with empty hands and a racing heart, unable to produce the documents that would prove everything I'd been saying for the past 8 months. Judge Eleanor Whitfield peered at me over her reading glasses, her expression somewhere between confusion and disappointment. She'd asked me a simple question. Where was the documentation from my father's safe that I'd referenced in my deposition? The safe that contained the original will, the property deeds, the insurance policies, and 23 years of meticulous financial records that my father had kept. My mouth went dry. I looked at my attorney, Raymond Okonkwo, who closed his eyes briefly, the kind of gesture that told me he was preparing for the worst. I turned back to the judge and said the only thing I could say, "Your Honor, I don't have them anymore." That's when Garrett leaned back in his chair and spoke the words that would change everything. I cleaned it out. He didn't need it. The courtroom went so quiet I could hear the bailiff's leather belt creak as he shifted his weight. Judge Whitfield's pen stopped moving. She looked at my brother with an expression I couldn't quite read. 8 months earlier, I'd been standing in my father's hospital room at St. Vincent's Medical Center, watching monitors track his heartbeat in green peaks and valleys. Dad had been fighting pancreatic cancer for 14 months, and we all knew we were in the final stretch. He'd called both of us there, me and Garrett, for what he said would be an important conversation. I was 34 years old, a civil engineer working for the city of Portland, and I'd spent the past year driving an hour each way to see him 3 times a week. Garrett was 37, lived 15 minutes from the hospital, and had visited maybe 6 times total. But Dad never said anything about that. He wasn't the type to keep score, at least not out loud. That afternoon, with the October rain streaking the window and a nurse checking his IV every 20 minutes, Dad told us about the safe. It was a fireproof document safe he'd kept in the basement of the family home, the same house where Garrett now lived, having moved in 2 years prior when his second divorce left him temporarily homeless. "Everything you need is in that safe," Dad said, his voice thin but clear. "The will, the property deeds, the life insurance policies, the investment account statements. I've kept records of everything. Nathan, I'm naming you executor. Your brother knows this. We've discussed it." I looked at Garrett, expecting some kind of reaction, but he just nodded slowly, his arms crossed over his chest. Dad had made his decision years ago, and apparently they'd already had this conversation privately. I'd always been the responsible one, the one who paid his bills on time and showed up when he said he would. Garrett had charm and ambition, but he also had a trail of bad decisions, failed business ventures, 2 divorces, and a habit of borrowing money he never quite got around to repaying. Dad loved us both, but he trusted me with the practical matters. After Dad passed away on November 3rd, I gave myself 2 weeks to grieve before diving into the executor duties. The funeral was on a Saturday, a gray morning with a crowd of nearly 200 people who'd known Dad from his years as a high school principal. Garrett gave a moving eulogy that made several people cry. I sat in the front row, too numb to speak. The following Thursday, I drove to the family home to retrieve the documents from the safe. Garrett met me at the door with a beer in his hand, even though it was barely noon. The house looked different, messier, with dishes piled in the sink and mail stacked on every flat surface. I asked him to show me where Dad had kept the safe. He shrugged and said he'd moved it to the garage because the basement had gotten damp. We walked out to the garage together, and there it was, a gray steel safe about 3 feet tall, the same one I remembered from childhood. Garrett handed me the key, which he said Dad had given him before he died. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I opened the safe expecting to find everything Dad had described, the original will, the insurance policies, the investment account numbers, the property deeds for the house, the rental property up in Salem, and the lakefront cabin near Bend. Instead, I found a single sheet of paper, a handwritten note in what looked vaguely like Dad's handwriting, though something about the lettering seemed off. The note said, "I leave everything to Garrett. He needs it more. Nathan will understand." My heart started pounding. I read it 3 times, then looked at my brother. He was leaning against the garage door frame, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite identify. "Dad changed his mind," Garrett said. "He told me a couple months ago. Said he didn't want to make a big deal about it because he knew you'd be upset." I stood there holding that piece of paper, trying to process what was happening. This couldn't be right. Dad had been explicit with me multiple times about his wishes. The house and the rental property were to be sold, and the proceeds split evenly. The cabin was supposed to go to me because I'd spent every summer there with him since I was a kid. The life insurance, a policy worth nearly $400,000, was to be divided equally after covering funeral expenses. But here was this note, and here was my brother insisting this was Dad's final wish. I asked where the original will was, the one Dad had filed with his attorney. Garrett said he didn't know anything about that Dad must have destroyed it when he changed his mind. Something didn't feel right, but I couldn't articulate exactly what. My grief was still too raw, my thoughts too scattered. I left that day with the handwritten note and a growing sense of unease. The next morning, I called Dad's estate attorney, a woman named Patricia Yamamoto, who'd handled his legal affairs for over a decade. She confirmed that Dad had indeed filed a will with her office 3 years prior, a will that named me as executor and divided assets between Garrett and me, according to exactly what Dad had told me in the hospital. But when I mentioned the handwritten note Garrett had shown me, she went quiet for a long moment. "Nathan," she said carefully, "under state law, a handwritten will can supersede a formal will if it meets certain criteria. It has to be entirely in the deceased's handwriting, signed, and dated. Did this note meet those requirements?" I thought about it. The note was handwritten, yes. It was signed Dad at the bottom, not his full legal name, and there was no date anywhere on the paper. I told Patricia this, and I heard her let out a small breath. "That's significant," she said, "but you'll need to have the original documents to challenge it properly. The formal will I have on file is a copy. Your father kept the original in his personal safe." My stomach dropped. The safe that was now empty. The safe that Garrett had been living with for 2 years. Over the next few weeks, things escalated in ways I never anticipated. Garrett filed the handwritten note with the probate court, claiming it represented Dad's final wishes. He also filed paperwork claiming sole possession of the family home under the note's vague language. When I tried to access Dad's bank accounts to pay for outstanding medical bills and funeral expenses I'd covered on my credit card with the understanding that the estate would reimburse me, I discovered that Garrett had already drained them. He'd withdrawn over $60,000 in cash just 3 days after Dad's death, using a power of attorney document that I'd never seen before. I called him that night, my hands shaking as I held the phone. "What the hell are you doing?" I asked him. "I'm protecting what's mine," he said, his voice cold in a way I'd never heard before. "Dad wanted me to have this, Nathan. You've always had everything handed to you. The good grades, the stable job, the perfect life. I needed this. Dad understood that." I tried to reason with him. I reminded him that I'd been the one visiting Dad every week, that I'd been the one coordinating his care, that I'd been the one who held his hand when he took his last breath. Garrett just laughed. "And I'm supposed to feel bad because you had more time with him? That's your reward. This is mine." He hung up before I could respond. I hired an attorney the next day, Raymond Okonkwo, a probate litigation specialist with 19 years of experience who came highly recommended by Patricia Yamamoto. Raymond was a serious man in his early 50s with graying temples and a calm, methodical way of speaking that made me feel like I was in competent hands. Our first meeting lasted 3 hours. I showed him everything I had, copies of Dad's original will from Patricia's office, bank statements showing Garrett's withdrawals, the suspicious handwritten note, and the power of attorney document that had materialized from nowhere. Raymond studied each document carefully, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When he finished, he looked up at me with a measured expression. "The good news is that the handwritten note probably won't hold up in court. It's not dated, it's not signed with your father's full legal name, and the handwriting will need to be verified by a forensic document examiner. The bad news is that your brother has already liquidated significant assets, and recovering those funds will be a separate battle." He paused, then continued. "But the biggest problem is the missing documents from your father's safe. Without the original will, the original property deeds, and the financial records, we're fighting with one hand tied behind our back." I told Raymond I'd try to recover whatever I could. Over the following weeks, I became something of an amateur detective. I requested copies of property deeds from the county recorder's office. I contacted Dad's insurance company and bank to get duplicate statements. I spent hours on the phone with various agencies, explaining the situation over and over, faxing death certificates and proof of my executor status, a status that Garrett was simultaneously trying to have revoked through the probate court. Every step forward seemed to come with 2 steps back. The insurance company informed me that Garrett had already filed a claim on Dad's life insurance policy, using the handwritten note as justification, and they'd paid out the full amount to him directly. The bank said that without the original account agreements, they couldn't reverse the withdrawals Garrett had made. The property management company that handled Dad's rental in Salem said that Garrett had presented himself as the new owner and was already collecting rent checks. My brother had moved fast, faster than I ever would have expected. In my grief, I'd given him a 2-week head start, and he'd used every minute of it. I started having trouble sleeping. I'd lie awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations with Dad, and trying to understand how things had gone so wrong. 4 months into this nightmare, I got a call that changed everything. It was from a woman named Diana Prescott, a forensic document examiner with 22 years of experience who Raymond had hired to analyze the handwritten note. Her findings were unambiguous. "This document was not written by your father," she said. I was sitting in my car in a parking lot, having pulled over when I saw her number on my phone. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. "Are you certain?" I asked. "I've examined over 3,000 questioned documents in my career," she said. "I compared this note to verified samples of your father's handwriting, letters he wrote, checks he signed, documents from his employment records. The letter formations are inconsistent. The slant is wrong. The pressure patterns don't match. Someone attempted to imitate your father's handwriting, but they made several characteristic errors. In my professional opinion, This note is a forgery. I sat there in silence for a long moment, processing what she'd just told me. My brother hadn't just stolen from me. He'd forged a document to do it. He'd taken advantage of our father's death to fabricate evidence of wishes that never existed. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I felt physically sick. I thanked Diana and ended the call, then sat in that parking lot for nearly an hour, trying to decide what to do next. Raymond filed an amended complaint with the probate court the following week, alleging fraud, forgery, and breach of fiduciary duty. We attached Diana Prescott's expert analysis, along with side-by-side comparisons of the handwritten note and verified samples of Dad's writing. We also filed a motion to freeze any remaining assets and requested an emergency hearing. Garrett's attorney, a man named Franklin Dubois, who was known for representing clients in contentious inheritance disputes, responded with a counter-motion claiming that our expert analysis was biased and that the handwritten note was genuine. He also filed a motion to have me removed as executor entirely, arguing that I had a conflict of interest. The legal back and forth was exhausting. Every motion required a response. Every response required documentation. Every piece of documentation required verification. I was spending thousands of dollars I didn't have on legal fees, taking time off work to attend hearings and depositions, and watching my savings evaporate while Garrett lived comfortably in Dad's house, collecting rent from Dad's property and spending Dad's money. Meanwhile, I still hadn't been reimbursed for the $12,000 I'd put on my credit card for Dad's funeral and final medical expenses. The interest was accumulating. My credit score was dropping. I was borrowing against my retirement to pay Raymond's invoices. The breaking point came in early April, 6 months after Dad's death. I'd driven up to Salem to visit the rental property, the one Dad had owned for 15 years, the one he'd always planned to leave to both of us. A tenant named Gerald Huang had been living there for 8 years, a retired postal worker who'd known my father personally. When I knocked on the door and introduced myself, Gerald's face fell. "I'm so sorry about your dad," he said. "He was a good man. But I should tell you, your brother was here last month. He said he's selling the property, gave me 60 days to vacate." My stomach dropped. Garrett was selling Dad's property without my consent, without court approval, without any legal right to do so. I called Raymond from my car. His response was grim. "He's trying to liquidate everything before the court rules. He knows he's going to lose eventually, so he's grabbing whatever he can while he still has access." Raymond said we could file an emergency motion to halt the sale, but it would take time Garrett was using to his advantage. I drove home that night in a daze, wondering how my own brother had become capable of this. We'd grown up together. We'd shared a bedroom until I was 12. We'd played catch in the backyard and fought over the last slice of pizza and stood side by side at our mother's funeral when she passed from breast cancer 15 years ago. Somewhere along the line, Garrett had become someone I didn't recognize. The hearing was scheduled for a Monday morning in late May, exactly 8 months after Dad's death. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled walls, fluorescent lighting, and hard wooden benches that reminded me of church pews. Judge Eleanor Whitfield presided, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and a reputation for running a tight courtroom. Raymond had prepared me extensively for what to expect. I would be called to testify about my relationship with Dad, his stated wishes, and the circumstances surrounding the discovery of the handwritten note. The prosecution, my side, would present Diana Prescott's forensic analysis and call witnesses who could attest to Dad's intentions. Garrett's attorney would try to discredit our evidence and paint me as a bitter, jealous sibling who couldn't accept that Dad had chosen differently. What Raymond hadn't prepared me for was the question that would unravel everything. I'd been on the stand for nearly an hour, walking through the timeline of events, when Judge Whitfield interrupted the attorneys and addressed me directly. "Mr. Holloway," she said, using my last name in that formal way judges do, "you've testified that your father kept extensive documentation in his personal safe. Tax returns, investment statements, insurance policies, property deeds. You claim these documents would corroborate your account of his wishes." She paused, looking at me over her reading glasses. "Where are those documents now? Why haven't they been entered into evidence?" I felt my throat tighten. This was the question I'd been dreading since the moment I opened that empty safe. Raymond had coached me on how to answer, but the words still felt inadequate. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "When I went to retrieve the documents from my father's safe after his death, the safe was empty. Only the handwritten note remained." Judge Whitfield frowned. "Empty? You're telling me that years of financial records simply vanished?" "Yes, Your Honor. My brother had been living in the house for 2 years prior to my father's death. He had access to the safe. I believe—" That's when Garrett cut me off. He stood up from the plaintiff's table, ignoring his attorney's attempt to pull him back down. He was smiling, that same confident, easy smile he'd always used to charm his way out of trouble. "I cleaned it out," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "He didn't need it." The courtroom went silent. Absolutely silent. I could hear the air conditioning humming through the vents. Judge Whitfield's pen, which had been moving across her notepad, stopped mid-stroke. She looked at Garrett with an expression that shifted from surprise to something harder, something cold. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice dangerously quiet. Franklin Dubois was on his feet now, trying to do damage control. Your Honor, my client misspoke. He simply meant, sit down, Mr. Dubois. The judge's words cracked through the room like a whip. Dubois sat. Judge Whitfield turned her full attention to Garrett, who was still standing, though his smile had started to falter. Mr. Holloway, she said, and hearing her use our shared last name felt strange, like she was addressing both of us at once. Did you just admit, in open court, to destroying evidence relevant to this probate proceeding? Garrett's jaw worked. I could see him trying to calculate, trying to find the words that would get him out of this, but there was no getting out of it. He'd said what he'd said, in front of a judge, on the record, with a court reporter capturing every syllable. I didn't destroy anything, he finally said. I just moved some things, old papers. They weren't important. Judge Whitfield's expression didn't change. Mr. Holloway, I am going to ask you a direct question, and I strongly advise you to answer truthfully. Under penalty of perjury, did you remove documents from your father's safe, documents that were relevant to his estate and to this proceeding, and dispose of them in any way? Garrett's attorney was practically vibrating in his seat, desperate to intervene. But the judge had asked a direct question, and Garrett had to answer. I watched my brother's face cycle through several emotions in rapid succession. Defiance, fear, calculation, and finally a kind of sullen resignation. Some of them, yeah, he admitted, but only because they were outdated, old statements and stuff. Nothing that mattered. Nothing that mattered, the judge repeated, her voice flat. She turned to the court reporter. Let the record reflect that the plaintiff has admitted to removing and disposing of documents from the deceased's estate prior to probate. Then she did something nobody expected. She removed her reading glasses, set them on her desk, and folded her hands. Mr. Dubois, she said, addressing Garrett's attorney, I am going to give you 5 minutes to confer with your client. During that time, I suggest you explain to him the legal consequences of what he has just admitted. Destruction of estate documents is a felony in this state. Obstruction of probate proceedings is a felony. Perjury, which I strongly suspect has occurred multiple times during these proceedings, is a felony. She paused, letting those words sink in. When we reconvene, I will be issuing my preliminary ruling. I suggest your client use this time wisely. She banged her gavel and called a recess. I sat frozen at the witness stand, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. Raymond came to my side immediately, his face a mask of professional calm, even though I could see the excitement in his eyes. This is good, he said quietly. This is very good. I watched Garrett and his attorney huddled in the corner, their conversation increasingly animated. Garrett's face had gone pale. He kept shaking his head, making sharp gestures with his hands. I could imagine what Dubois was telling him, that he'd just confessed to multiple felonies in open court, that the judge was clearly furious, that whatever strategy they'd planned was now completely useless. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I just felt hollow. This was my brother, the kid I'd grown up with, the teenager who'd taught me how to drive, the young man who'd given the toast at my wedding. How had we ended up here, in a courtroom, fighting over the bones of our father's legacy? The 5 minutes felt like an hour. When Judge Whitfield returned, her expression was granite. She didn't sit down immediately. Instead, she stood behind her bench, looking out at both tables, her gaze lingering on Garrett. I've been on this bench for 16 years, she said. In that time, I've seen countless disputes over estates, inheritances, and family assets. I've seen siblings tear each other apart over money. I've seen children contest the wishes of parents they barely knew. She paused, but I have rarely seen such a blatant, deliberate attempt to defraud an estate and obstruct these proceedings. Mr. Garrett Holloway, you have admitted on the record to destroying documents central to this case. You have presented a handwritten note that forensic analysis indicates is a forgery. You have withdrawn funds from your father's accounts using a power of attorney document that I now have serious doubts was legitimately obtained. You have attempted to sell property that is properly part of this estate. And you have done all of this while your brother, who was appointed executor in your father's legitimate will, grieved and tried to honor your father's actual wishes. She sat down, finally, and picked up a document from her desk. I am issuing the following rulings, effective immediately. First, the handwritten note presented by the plaintiff is hereby declared invalid. It fails to meet the statutory requirements for a holographic will, and there is substantial evidence it is a forgery. Second, the formal will filed by Patricia Yamamoto, Esquire, is hereby confirmed as the controlling testamentary document. Third, Mr. Nathan Holloway is confirmed as executor of the estate, with full authority to manage and distribute assets according to the deceased's wishes. She turned another page. Fourth, all assets improperly obtained or disposed of by the plaintiff, including but not limited to the life insurance proceeds, the funds withdrawn from estate accounts, and any rent collected from estate property, are hereby ordered to be returned to the estate within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in contempt charges. Garrett made a sound, something between a laugh and a groan. His attorney put a hand on his arm. Judge Whitfield wasn't finished. Fifth, I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of potential criminal charges, including but not limited to forgery, theft, obstruction of legal process, and destruction of evidence. Mr. Holloway, I strongly suggest you retain criminal defense counsel. She looked at Garrett with an expression that was almost sad. You had a father who loved you. You had a brother who would have shared his inheritance with you. And you threw it all away for greed. I hope someday you understand the magnitude of what you've done. She banged her gavel. Court is adjourned. The aftermath unfolded over the following months, like dominoes falling. True to her word, Judge Whitfield referred the case to the district attorney. An investigator named Thomas Brennan, a 15-year veteran of the white-collar crimes unit, was assigned to the case. He subpoenaed Garrett's bank records, phone records, and computer files. What he found was even worse than I'd imagined. The power of attorney document Garrett had used to drain Dad's accounts. Forged, using a notary stamp that had been reported stolen from a law office 6 months earlier. The handwritten note claiming Dad had changed his wishes. Written on paper that forensic analysis dated to less than a week before Dad's death, a time when Dad was heavily sedated and barely conscious. There were also text messages between Garrett and an acquaintance of his, a man named Douglas Ferraro, discussing how to make it look right and get the timing down. Douglas, it turned out, had previous forgery convictions. He'd been paid $3,000 to help Garrett create the fake documents. Investigator Brennan laid it all out for me in his office one afternoon, 8 months after the court hearing. Your brother planned this for at least 6 months before your father died, he said. He knew your father's wishes. He knew he wasn't going to get what he wanted through legitimate means, so he decided to take it anyway. I asked Brennan what would happen next. He said Garrett had been offered a plea deal, plead guilty to forgery and theft, serve 2 to 4 years in state prison, and make full restitution to the estate. If he refused the deal, he'd go to trial facing charges that could result in up to 12 years. Garrett took the deal. I didn't attend his sentencing hearing. I couldn't. Raymond went on my behalf and reported back that Garrett had made a brief statement apologizing to the court, though notably not to me. The judge sentenced him to 30 months in prison and ordered him to pay back every dollar he'd taken, plus interest and legal fees. The total restitution amount was just over $480,000, money Garrett didn't have, which meant he'd be paying it off for the rest of his life. I sold the family home that summer. I couldn't bear the thought of keeping it, knowing what had happened there. The rental property in Salem went too, with Gerald Huang receiving a generous moving assistance fund from the proceeds. I kept the cabin near Bend, the one Dad had always wanted me to have, and I visited it for the first time since his death on what would have been his 73rd birthday. Sitting on that cabin's deck, watching the sun set over the lake, I finally let myself feel everything I'd been holding back. The grief, the anger, the bewilderment at how my own brother could have betrayed our father's memory so completely. But also something else, a kind of peace. Dad's wishes had been honored. His legacy was intact. The people he'd wanted to provide for, including a scholarship fund at the high school where he'd been principal for 22 years, would receive what he'd intended. I scattered some of his ashes in the lake that evening, as he'd requested in his real will. The water was still and golden in the fading light. I said a few words, nothing eloquent, just the kind of rambling things you say when you're talking to someone who can't answer. I told him I missed him. I told him I was sorry things had gotten so ugly. I told him I hoped, wherever he was, he could see that his real wishes had been carried out. A fish jumped somewhere in the distance, breaking the surface with a small splash. I chose to take it as a sign. It's been 3 years since that day at the lake. I'm 40 now. I got promoted to senior engineer at work. I moved to a bigger apartment with my partner May, who stuck by me through all of this despite the stress and the financial strain and the countless evenings I spent buried in legal documents instead of present with her. We're talking about buying a house, maybe something near the cabin, something with a view of the water. Garrett gets out of prison in 4 months. I haven't decided yet whether I'll speak to him when he does. Part of me wants to understand, wants to salvage something from the wreckage of our relationship. Another part of me knows that some betrayals are too deep to repair, that the brother I grew up with died somewhere along the way and was replaced by someone I don't recognize. A few weeks ago, I received a letter from him, prison stationery, handwritten. It was 3 pages long and full of apologies. Apologies for what he did, apologies for what he put me through, apologies for betraying Dad's memory. He said prison had given him time to think, to really think, about what kind of person he'd become and why. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, but he wanted me to know he was sorry. I read that letter 3 times. Then I put it in a drawer and haven't looked at it since. I don't know what to do with it. I don't know what to do with him. Maybe forgiveness will come eventually, or maybe it won't. What I do know is that I honored my father's wishes. I protected his legacy. I stood in that courtroom with nothing but the truth, and the truth was enough. When Garrett smiled and said he'd cleaned out the safe, he thought he was delivering the killing blow. He thought he'd outmaneuvered me completely. But what he'd actually done was hand Judge Whitfield the evidence she needed to see him for exactly what he was. The truth has a way of doing that, of finding the cracks in carefully constructed lies and flooding through them until the whole edifice collapses. Garrett spent 2 years building his scheme. He spent months forging documents and draining accounts and planning his takeover of Dad's estate. And he destroyed it all with one sentence, spoken in arrogance, because he couldn't resist showing me that he'd won. Except he hadn't won. The truth doesn't care about schemes or plans or forged documents. It just waits. And eventually, it speaks. Dad used to say that character is what you do when no one is watching. I think about that a lot these days. Garrett thought no one was watching when he emptied that safe. He thought no one was watching when he forged that note. He thought no one was watching when he drained those accounts. But someone was always watching. If not a person, then the record of his actions, the trail of evidence, the patterns that investigators like Thomas Brennan are trained to find. He thought he could operate in shadows, but shadows have a way of coming into light. I'm not the same person I was before all this happened. I'm harder in some ways, more cynical about family and trust. But I'm also more certain about who I am and what I stand for. I stood up for my father's wishes when it would have been easier to walk away. I fought for the truth when lies would have been simpler. I learned that doing the right thing isn't always rewarded immediately, but it's rewarded eventually, if not by external circumstances, then by the knowledge that you can live with yourself. Dad would have been proud of that, I think. He spent his career as an educator trying to instill values in young people. Integrity, honesty, perseverance. He couldn't have known that his final lesson to me would come after his death, in a courtroom, against my own brother. The scholarship fund in his name awarded its first grants last spring. 4 students from his old high school received money for college. Kids from families that couldn't otherwise afford it. Kids who reminded the selection committee of what Dad had always said about education being the great equalizer. I attended the ceremony as a representative of the family. I didn't mention Garrett. Nobody asked. Afterwards, a woman approached me. She was in her 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes. She introduced herself as one of Dad's former students from 30 years ago. She told me that my father had believed in her when nobody else did, that he'd advocated for her to attend college when her guidance counselor said she wasn't college material. She'd gone on to become a nurse, raised 3 kids, and was now working at the same hospital where Dad had spent his final months. She said she'd held his hand once during a night shift, not knowing who he was at first, and that when she realized it was him, she'd thanked him for everything he'd done for her. She said he'd smiled and told her he was proud of her. I couldn't speak for a moment after she told me this. The tears came suddenly, unexpectedly, not from grief, but from something else entirely. The last time I visited the cabin was 2 weeks ago. The leaves were just starting to turn, gold and orange at the edges, the lake reflecting the colors like a mirror. I sat on the deck with a cup of coffee and watched the sunrise, thinking about everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. May is pregnant. We found out last month. If it's a boy, we're thinking of naming him after Dad. It feels right, a way of continuing his legacy that no court case could ever touch, no forged document could ever taint. Whatever happens with Garrett, whatever shape that relationship takes or doesn't take in the years ahead, this is my family now. This is my future. Dad built his legacy over 7 decades, as a teacher, as a principal, as a father, as a man of integrity. Garrett tried to steal that legacy in a few months of forgery and lies. He failed, and sitting on that deck, watching the sun rise over the water, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. Legacy isn't about money or property or insurance policies. It's about the lives you touch. It's about the people who remember you and how they remember you. It's about the values you pass on, the lessons you teach, the love you share. Dad's legacy lives on in the students he taught, in the scholarship fund bearing his name, in the memories of everyone who knew him. It lives on in me, in the values he instilled, in the way I try to treat people with honesty and respect. And someday, it will live on in my child, in stories I'll tell about a grandfather they never met but would have loved. Garrett couldn't steal that. No one can. The day I stood in that courtroom with empty hands, facing my brother's smug smile, I thought I'd lost everything, but I hadn't lost anything that mattered. I'd already inherited what was truly valuable, not from a safe or a will or a legal document, but from years of watching my father live his life with integrity. That's the inheritance no one can take. That's the legacy that endures. And when the judge did something nobody expected, when she saw through Garrett's lies and delivered the justice my father deserved, I realized that the truth has its own kind of power. It doesn't need documents or evidence or witnesses, though those things help. It just needs someone willing to speak it, even when speaking it seems hopeless. Dad spent his life teaching that lesson. In the end, he taught it to me one more time. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.